Hi, I'm Kels, and I'm the host of The Comparable, the series in which each episode highlights two companies building similar solutions in two different emerging markets. For our second episode, we're looking at two emerging markets that are on opposite sides of the world, Vietnam and Mexico, and spotlighting two digital bank startups building in both places. The rise of digital banks is significant for emerging markets because they can fundamentally transform financial access, economic opportunity, and inclusion for millions who were previously excluded by the traditional banking system. In countries where access to finance is filled with obstacles and barriers, digital banks can serve to unlock potential for both individuals and small and growing businesses. As far apart as Vietnam and Mexico seem, they're actually both significant hubs for financial innovation and technology in their regions, and have some interesting similarities that work well for this episode. While Singapore may be the fintech leader in Southeast Asia, Vietnam has emerged as one of the fastest growing and most dynamic fintech hubs in the region. On one hand, Vietnam has high smartphone adoption, 130%, and a very young tech-savvy population. 70% of Vietnam are digital natives. On the other hand, only about 20% of Vietnam's 90 million population uses banking services, and credit card penetration is just 3%, creating an enormous opportunity for financial services and innovation. Vietnam's fintech market size was estimated to be $16.9 billion in 2024 and is projected to reach $62.7 billion in 2033, so a huge amount of growth potential. Across the world, in Mexico, the opportunity for financial innovation is similarly large. Only about 49% of adults in Mexico have a bank account, and more than half of Mexican companies have never applied for a loan. The number is below the Latin American average and trails most of the larger economies in the region, like Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. At the same time, 81% of the 129.7 million population have internet access, and more than 80 million people use smartphones. So, similar to Vietnam, there's a huge opportunity for digital financial services to address this gap in Mexico. There are actually already over 1,000 fintechs in Mexico, including international players who have entered the market. The fintech market reached $20 billion in 2024 and is projected to grow to $65.9 billion by 2033. So, same, but different. For this episode, we're going to be spotlighting Timo in Vietnam, which launched in 2015 and is Vietnam's first digital bank. They recently celebrated their 10-year anniversary and have always stayed innovative and adaptive through their journey. Timo's CEO, Jonas Eichhorst, will be sitting down with us, and we'll be joined by Manuel Rivero, CEO of Hey Banco in Mexico. Hey Banco was originally the digital arm of Banregio, a very reputable and well-established bank in Mexico, and it's now in the process of becoming its own independent entity, which is slated to happen this year. We'll also be gathering insights from key investors in both markets. Tushar Roy leads the Southeast Asia practice at the VC fund SquarePeg, which led the $20 million funding round into Timo in 2022. And Leticia Jauregui has been an investor, entrepreneur, and ecosystem builder in Mexico for over 18 years. So, two great people to talk to about these two companies and also the opportunities and challenges that digital banks can face in these markets. So, let's get started. I'm now joined by my guests who are both building digital banks in their respective markets. Jonas Eichhorst is the CEO of Timo, Vietnam's first digital bank that launched in 2015 and has been growing and scaling their offering ever since. In 2022, they raised $20 million in a funding round led by VC fund SquarePeg, and in 2023 also announced $10 million in additional funding. Jonas actually became CEO of the company in 2022 after being involved with Timo for a number of years before that. So we're going to be hearing more about that. Our second guest is Manuel Rivero, the CEO of Hey Banco in Mexico. He also serves as the CEO of Grupo Regional, the parent company of Banregio. Hey Banco was originally the digital arm of Banregio, and it's now in the process of becoming its own independent entity, which is slated to happen this year with Manuel at the helm. I'm going to jump to the first question, guys. So this is for Jonas. And it's going to be a little bit about the journey to you becoming CEO, Jonas. Timo was established in 2015, as I noted, as Vietnam's first digital bank. You've been the CEO since September of 2022, around the same time that the $20 million of funding came in. But prior to that, you joined Timo's board first in 2020, you became CFO in 2021, and then you were promoted to the CEO role. Can you share more about your journey to leading the company? And you and I have known each other for a while. As someone who's been an advisor or investor in startups across emerging markets, why was this a role you wanted to take in being specifically a CEO in Vietnam? And how would you define Timo's vision today under your leadership?
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. Maybe the very, very short answer, I actually didn't want to be Timo CEO. So the way that usually we introduce Timo is, as you said, we're a 10-year-old company. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary about 3 weeks ago. But we went through what you could call almost refounding 5 years ago, when we changed our licensed banking partner, when we changed our shareholding structure quite a bit. And as part of that, I was a Timo customer before, but I was not involved in Timo from the management side or anything. But as part of that kind of transaction, I joined the board first, and then was actually quite happily working with a number, as you pointed out, of different startups, founders around the world. And I guess my background, maybe for full context, so my background is not finance at all. I've got a technology background. But I guess what happened over the last couple of years and decades now almost is that I always found myself being pulled into these kind of translation roles, translation between startup and enterprise, between tech and business, between investor and founder, between emerging markets and more developed markets. And yeah, when the Timo opportunity came up, I was very busy with other things, but got pulled into the board, and over time got more and more fascinated with what the guys had been building. So it was super early, first digital bank, fee-free, proper tech offering, and loved also that we from the get-go were positioned as kind of being the bank. So a very strong emotional resonance, a very strong focus on branding, on experience, not just on the financial products. And yeah, more or less by accident, the CFO piece was just the open slot maybe at the time, but the CEO at the time and our chairman, Henry, so him and I, we've known each other for 10 years, worked on many things together. So it was a natural transition of me being pulled in, and then in the end, yeah.
So were you pulled or pushed? Pulled or pushed into becoming CEO?
Maybe a mixture of both.
Okay.
But
hopefully a willing participant now.
Absolutely. Very happily.
And so tell us then, so with you now being at the helm of it, how does that translate into, is it the same vision? Obviously you mentioned 5 years ago, a shift for Timo, but like how, for you being at the helm, how is that translated into the leadership and the vision of the company?
I think the market has changed dramatically since we started 10 years ago, but also certain things have remained the same. And what is special about Timo probably is that most of us don't come from a financial services background, but Timo is that vehicle for us that we build, the platform that we always wish we would have as customers for ourselves. We very deeply believe in the emotional aspect of money. So finance is something that tends to be very functional from the market participant side, but is actually very emotional from a customer side, because everybody kind of dreams of not having to worry about money, being rich. Everybody fears that moment when they need money or when the account is empty. And so this kind of very different mindset, and a lot of the people that we recruit and the culture that we build, therefore, is very heavily focused on, ultimately, as we say, Timo exists to help 100 million Vietnamese confidently live richer. It's not about a financial product itself. And so what does confidence mean? What does rich living even mean? Starting from these principles is probably what sets us apart from many other organizations.
Awesome. And it's interesting that you guys don't really come from strong financial service backgrounds yourself. That is what makes you different. Moving to Manuel, who it's so interesting in this context because you're actually fourth generation of a family deeply involved in the Mexican banking industry. So in some ways, the opposite of this. Hey Banco is a leading Mexican digital bank. It was originally launched in 2019 as the digital arm of Banregio, a well-regarded and established regional bank in Mexico. And I've heard, obviously, you've been a big part of like really expanding that as well. And it'll be fully independent and spun out as an entity this year. You joined Banregio in 2003. You worked within a more traditional financial institution, this one for over 20 years. And you founded and are leading Hey Banco now. And I would love to learn a little bit more about your journey, right? As this like fourth gen person in the banking industry that's building something that's really innovative and different within a more traditional industry, but also a more traditional institution. Why did you feel that Hey Banco needed to exist? And then also, not just as part of a traditional incumbent, why did you feel like it needed to be its own separate entity now? And what's the vision?
Sure, for sure. Thanks, Kels. Well, for sure, a huge opportunity in Mexico to continue developing a lot the digital journeys that customers have. I mean, the amount of literacy that we have here is so low that sadly, the amount of high value products that come into existence for customers is so low. Mortgages, only 2 or 3% of our Hey Banco customers have a 3%. Only 3 or 4% have a auto loan. So it's the amount of value creation that the customers can have it's the potential is so huge. So that's what we see at the beginning of the creation of Hey Banco, that there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of customer base, but sadly, there's not the right amount of financial education, of knowledge, even of confidence that customers have that we technology offering can really have an impact on those customers and create a lot of value for them. So in that sense, that's the main driver that we have already seen from the beginning. That's how can we create value for these customers and how we can really create journeys that make a difference in the financial aspect of their lives, it's amazing how technology can deliver that. So in that sense, at the beginning, we started a lot with the DNA of Banregio, obviously understanding the risk part of the equation, right? But then a lot of knowledge that we have already gathered along the years on how those products need to be redefined, need to be added with a lot of journey, led to experiences that really make sure that the customers have a wealth creation of their own, right? That's the main aspect for it. So that's what the main driver. And things are going very well, and things of the regulatory framework has been allowing us to create more. And customers are pretty much really open about new experiences, as they have a lot of other services done through the apps. And obviously this creates a lot of hope for us that we could continue journeying customers and making more experiences and more fulfillment in many ways. So I think that's the main aspect of the journey, that it's really pretty awesome how customers are growing their wealth with us. And I think there's a lot of things to be done. Obviously, but then again, I think the direction it's great and very happy about it.
And just going into that, because there are a lot of traditional banks that have digital offerings. So why did you feel that Hey Banco needed to spin out on its own, be its own independent entity? And what's interesting, when I've gone to the Hey Banco website, it's a very different vibe and brand and feel. So I'm curious about the vision and the values there. Does it differ from where it came from, or how are you making it distinct from each other?
I saw that most of the digital offers out there, it's just like putting the product very conveniently, but that's not enough. That's not enough. That's just, I'll say, 30% of the equation, right? So we're missing all the aspects that we can create through a lot of knowledge and to a lot of homework, doing it on research labs and making sure that we have the correct journey for customers, right? So I think that's the real issue there. So I think there's none of even the big banks or the fintechs that have been really just being convenient, which is great. Convenience is, we all want convenience, right? But then again, how can we create the journeys, right? So how can we create this experience that really push value to our customers? And how can it just make sure that technology creates more confidence and then building up more and more complex in their financial lives, right? So I think that's the main issue, right?
Yeah, and maybe the reason why you felt like it needed to exist on its own, like as an entity.
Yeah, because it's been driving up. As we've been delivering more and more, customers are pushing more and more products from us, and they want more services. And this has been allowing us to really make sure that an independent entity will serve them better, right?
Got it. Yeah, no, that's fair. And Jonas, on talking about traditional banks and in Vietnam, right? I listened to a podcast that you did not too long ago where you spoke about how Vietnamese traditional banks have actually been really good at building out their digital offerings, right? So you're not just competing with other digital bank startups, but also these incumbents. And so how would you say the landscape looks for Timo in Vietnam? And how do you feel like you continue to innovate and make yourself stand out amongst the competition?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a lot of questions actually around Mexico. Maybe for disclosure, Henry and myself, we actually did a trip to Mexico and Brazil last year to study the market because obviously there's a lot of similarities in different places. But one of the things that's maybe very unique about Vietnam, from what I've seen at least, is there is no digital banking license. There are 45 local banks that all are functioning in some form, all of pretty reasonable scale. And because every bank in a certain way hopes and believes that they can be the winner in this game, of course, every bank is under pressure to how can you innovate, how can you create? And because Vietnam is, just from a macro perspective, the last 25, 30 years, it's been like clockwork, 6-7% every single year GDP growth. So there's a lot of this kind of competition and this view of how can we position ourselves as being the bank that is the winner in this kind of market. So the classic playbook is let's invest heavy into tech, into brand, into marketing, because those are big boardroom moves that you can make as a bank CEO. Vietnam also has a lot of tech talent. So a lot of this innovation is driven internally. So usually the way that I describe, it's very ironic that Timo gets invited to a lot of digital transformation conferences, panels, discussions around banking, because for us it's digital creation. But the question really is, can we create digitally faster than these banks can digitally transform? And in Vietnam, at least for our customer segment, what we realize is that a digital bank is more a marketing term than anything else. And so they really don't differentiate between whether they would bank with a Timo or with another one of the more tech upstarts or with a traditional bank. Some of them themselves even calling themselves now digital bank because it sounds more modern and interesting.
Or like neo challenger bank, which is super hot term to use.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Similar question for you, Manuel. You were talking about this before, but would love to delve into it a little bit more. The Mexican and Latin American fintech space has a lot of notable players, obviously like a lot of international players that have been entering Mexico as well, beyond just the local players that are there. To what degree do you feel that Hey Banco leans on the backbone of what Banregio has built? And to what degree do you innovate, position yourself against the competition and really see yourself as like kind of building independently in that way?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're helped a lot with the infrastructure of Banregio, for example, right? So that's a huge part of the equation. But another thing is how we have built a lot of the digital offerings. I mean, not only for individuals, but so sole proprietors and entrepreneurs alike, even kids. So we have a product for everyone, and that done very easily on onboarding digitally completely. And no bank has been able to do that in Mexico. No fintech has been able to do that. So it's a one-stop shop for everything. It's been a long journey, right? For sure. But then again, I think that's how we're leading the way. And the other thing, as Jonas said, there's a lot of branding in terms of how we can create a brand that resonates with our audience, and how we can just create a brand that really makes sure, as Jonas said, it's the non-bank bank, right? How can we position ourselves in a way that customers see us in a very more friendly manner? Because sadly, I mean, big banks are doing a lot of money for sure, but then again, they're not really making sure that the experience is there, right? So it's not customer centric. It's based on efficiency costs and on the other aspects of the companies, but not so much as the experience of the customer. So they're not really resonating with the customer base, as we have like millions of visitors in our TikTok and our Instagram accounts, and it's social media aspect of it's huge. And I think obviously that's part of the equation for sure.
Yeah. And I think that was something I found so interestingly similar between Timo and Hey Banco was who you guys are appealing to and how you guys are thinking about brand and experience is a big part of that appeal Jonas, you actually once, probably in that same interview, you used the term unhappily banked rather than just unbanked. And I really love that because I actually think that's really true for most customers, right? Is that you may have a product that you use, but you may not be fully happy with it. So how do you also capture that? And to that, on that note, I wanted to ask you both about that. So with the vision that you guys both have towards financial inclusion, independence, you guys are both focused on young and tech savvy customers. Hey Banco also focuses on SMEs. You mentioned, Manuel, deeply customer centric approach. In building, growing, and scaling those respective user bases, what were ways that you approached and marketed to those customer segments that both illustrate the nuances of Vietnam and Mexico and what was unique about those places and things that also just clicked? What clicked with what you guys were building with the customer base?
For example, one thing that we did is how the Hey shops, right? So it's amazing how we just like putting a physical space and being able to have experience other than digital. It's been amazing. And in those spaces, you can choose from a lot of designs for your credit card. It's for your debit credit card, which is, it's amazing. I mean, you have a lot of proudness in selecting your own design, which is, it's amazing. And we have all the merchandising. So, and I think Timo has all this. I read about it too, right? So this is
Like hangouts.
Yeah, the hangouts, right? I love that. Yeah,
super
so
similar. Yeah,
yeah, for sure. So it's how can we create experiences that are beyond digital, right? So and being able to just invest on those aspects of the brand, which normally it's not well sought for many, right? So I think in that sense is something that I find that it's creating a lot of traction and people are loving those experiences.
Yeah. And in person really creates a lot of trust, right? Oftentimes that's really important. When something is fully digital, it's really hard to get that tangibility of the brand. But Jonas, would love to hear your thoughts as well.
100% with Manuel on this one. And it's a constant discussion. So there are digital banks in Vietnam that are proudly 100% digital only. And we think that's actually a big mistake. We are strong believers in convergence of online and offline. But of course, you want to do online what you want to do online as much as possible, but you also want to know that there is this offline kind of capability to connect with a brand in meaningful ways. And in fact, I think this also goes a lot towards looking at other industries. A company that I admire a lot is Duolingo, for example. Who loved school? Education is supposed to be so boring and something so painful. And then you have this company coming along, which creates suddenly this whole brand cult following around something that traditionally has been a very boring industry. I would say one of the things that really for us was a big driver of differentiation goes back to the people and to the culture. Because Manuel was mentioning earlier on, banks have done traditionally very well at making money, but this also comes to an outlook of how do you feel about the customer. And something that starts and has resonated with me personally very strongly for many years, but is this simple mindset of in growth markets like Mexico, Vietnam, many emerging markets. Actually, the great thing is it's not a zero-sum game. You're actually in the value creation, and it's actually a question of what value can you capture of the value being created. But we believe that if a customer gets 10, the customer will very happily give us 1 of that 10 in value. Traditionally, financial services companies have, because they control the bank account, they've taken 1, whether they create 10 in value or not. They don't really care about that. But if you start from that kind of mindset of create value and then you will participate in that upside, that is where everything around communication, around how people perceive you, how people treat the hangout experience or the Hey shops, if I got the name correct in Mexico, how all of that connects and resonates with a customer.
Yeah. By the way, I love the similarities in that, right, of the Timo Hangout, but also love the brand for the Hey on the Hey shops as well. I'm curious for both of you, as we're talking about this, there's so much that is positive in terms of your growth and how you guys are innovating, out competing your competitors. But obviously, there's still a lot of challenges in building these companies in the markets that you're in. Would love to hear from both of you. What are the biggest challenges that you're facing right now? What's keeping you both up at night, work-wise? We can have a separate therapy discussion about what's keeping you up personally, but about from a work perspective, what's keeping you up?
No, I guess that regulation, I mean, sadly, is not there. The regulatory framework needs to advance in a way that we can make sure that we're much more agile. I think that's the main issue for us. It's like, the authorities are making a great job on trying to make it work, but sadly, we need much more experiences. Much more agile working with, because sadly we need to build, more experiences easily, right? So I think that needs to be. It doesn't wake me up, but definitely it's something that hinders our way of understanding how customers react to products. And I guess
if you were to give a piece of feedback, and I similarly, by the way, as someone who works in Foxconn, I could write a book about what regulators need to do. And I have written a lot about what you need to improve. But if you were to give one piece of advice as feedback to the Mexican regulator on how to improve the space for fintech and for what you guys are building, what would you say?
We need larger sandbox in a way that we can create things without adding risk to the system, right? So we can make sure that we have the enough wiggle room to create innovation, right? So in a sense, I think that would be my main thing that I would ask.
Yeah, it's changed for us over the years a little bit. So today, Timo almost is the kind of B2B2C space of us being that middle B and working with a lot of regulated entities, partners across many different financial services and products, because truth be told, our strength is not regulatory knowledge necessarily. And the landscape here, similar to what Manuel was mentioning, is not necessarily one where it's very easy to launch new products, financial products. And so a lot of our differentiation is around that experience and that kind of how do you package a financial product in a way that is much more accessible from a consumer side. I think for us, the big battle is in a certain way getting the right balance between moving as quickly as possible and understanding where we can be very aggressive, and having at the same time the correct level of patience and realism also on what simply takes time to mature. And trust is a great example. We can today claim that we are 10 years in the market, and that's great, and that creates a lot of trust. There's no amount of money that you can use, no matter how much funding you would blow into something to have that kind of claim. And time in market, for better or worse, and I'm guessing Mexico will be similar because it's just human nature, but time in market is a huge driver of trust in the brand. And so finding that right balance of how can we be as aggressive as possible and make those big, bold moves, whilst also being realistic around what the timelines and levels and orders of magnitude of effects can be.
Yeah, and just reflecting on whenever we talk about this Silicon Valley growth at all costs, when we talk about the realities of emerging markets, it takes longer, right? Because you're basically building the market in front of you. So that type of just break things is, and first of all, in fintech is much more difficult to do because obviously these are spaces that breaking things is not good, especially when you're trying to build trust with a consumer base, when you have regulated industries. So I always think that whenever people say that, it's such a misguided statement. It's just with emerging markets, there's a real reality here of how you have to build for the nuances of where you guys are. For you both, would love to hear maybe Jonas first and then Manuel. What does success look like for both of you when it comes Timo and to Hey Banco?
Yeah, maybe just very quickly, it's funny you mentioned before the move fast break things, because internally, and it may not be the most polite comment for the podcast, but internally we have a joke that, sure, that statement is correct in a lot of tech companies, but in fintech, it's move fast break things, go to jail. And for good reasons, because if we're dealing with people's money, you got to behave a little bit differently, obviously, for very good reasons, which may be trying to link it to your question of what does success look like. It's a question I think about quite a bit, but also don't actually really want to think that much about, because success is very rear view afterwards. Okay, is Timo a success or not, or whatever, and different people will have different definitions of what success means. So in a certain way, I think for us and for myself, we can only say something is successful if we are proud of what we have done there. Of course, if our customers believe that we created value for them, if a regulator believes we did something good for the industry, if our shareholders, investors think that we did something great, I don't really want to get into the are we a success or not debate, because everybody can have different views of that. I think I'm much more interested in the kind of forward, what are the inputs that every day we bring to that job, and that kind of mindset of trying to create something of value. And as long as we focus on those inputs, then the success or whatever that may be will take care of itself, is my maybe slightly native view or
No, I
idealistic
love
view.
that.
But
That's the view a CEO should have, right? And someone who's trying to inspire people, especially on like your 10-year anniversary of existing as Timo. Manuel, would love to hear from you.
Sure. For us, as I said before, the value creation for our customers. I mean, how can we really make sure that our customers are creating value with our offering? I mean, we really want to wealthier clients, for sure. We really make sure that customers are getting from point A to point B faster, easier, we're more confident. So for us, doing it in a sustainable way, obviously financially for us makes the definition of success, right? So being able to create wealth for our customers and doing so in a very sustainable manner, which I think it's a huge, I will say, gap. I mean, as I said, normally banks or fintechs are just getting the product out there, just like trying to get it more conveniently. But then again, there's no responsibility on how customers are using the product, right? So that's not enough, right? It's for sure. We can make a lot of money there, but then again, are we creating value for our customers? And then for us, that would be the definition of success.
Great. Both great North Stars to have. Thank you guys so much for joining me today for this episode, and excited to keep track of both of your journeys with what's happening with Hey Banco and with Timo. Welcome back. This is a segment we call Investor Insights, where we sit down with the key investors involved in the companies and markets we highlight each episode. We'll cover the market opportunity and challenges, and also delve into some interesting insights and takeaways about both Timo and Hey Banco. With me today, I have Tushar Roy, a partner at SquarePeg, a venture capital fund backing founders solving big problems in AI, fintech, and SaaS. Tushar has been with the firm since 2015 and was instrumental in SquarePeg leading the $20 million funding round into Timo in 2022. My other guest is a good friend of mine, Leticia, who is a general partner at Leap Global Partners, a venture fund backing Latinx-led startups in fintech and enterprise tech. She's been an entrepreneur, investor, and ecosystem builder in Mexico and Latin America for over 18 years. Because Hey Banco is being spun out from Banregio and didn't raise outside capital, we invited her to share insights with us from her investor lens on the Mexican fintech opportunity and Hey Banco's recent growth. Welcome, guys. My first question is for Tushar. Tushar, you joined SquarePeg in 2015. You've led the Southeast Asia practice there from day one. And in early 2022, SquarePeg led the $20 million funding round into Timo, and you continue to stay close to the company. I'm curious about your thesis when it comes to fintech in Southeast Asia. What led to the decision to invest in Timo, and when you did, and why is Vietnam exciting for fintech?
So we decided to enter the Southeast Asian market because we saw some tremendous macro trends in the market. When you look at the region, it comprises of some of the fastest growing economies in the world. That in turn is creating one of the largest middle classes that's also extremely young. It's mobile native, increasingly better educated, aspirational, consumptive, and most importantly, globally connected. Like they know exactly what's going on in other parts of the world. The related transition that's driving in these markets and markets like Vietnam is a transition from unbanked or underbanked to banked. It may surprise people to know that many people in many of these countries still don't have a bank account. In many of these countries, bank accounts cost money. And some people, if they do have one, have a very basic one. So much of the population in Vietnam, for example, is still outside the cities and it's considered semi-rural. We also know from macroeconomic theory that the ease of flow of money and the availability of credit are key inputs that drive the continued growth of these economies, particularly of the segment that I just mentioned. And the reality that we've seen is that it's very hard for existing incumbent financial services infrastructure in these markets to keep pace with the demands of this segment or to innovate significantly. And that really paves the way for fintechs, to come in, use technology to build sizable businesses and solve these problems. And Vietnam, for me, encapsulates some of these trends. Half the population, roughly, is under 35, very high mobile penetration, mobile first, very rapid growth in digital payment rails. I mean, the nation just launched a while back a QR payment system that's taken off immensely, but it's still a large chunk of the population is underbanked and has very poor access to innovative banking and payment and credits. And it's really through that kind of high-level thesis that we honed in on Timo. It sought to address these unmet needs digitally without traditional branch networks, based primarily on a superior product offering that focused on easing the payments for people, and then using that as a wedge through which to distribute more products like credit and insurance. And for us, a lot of our investment thesis is driven by teams. And in Timo, we saw a team that is quite uniquely positioned in the market to navigate not only the innovation side of the journey, but also the regulatory side. It is non-trivial in these markets to build regulated businesses. And I think you need to make sure that when you're investing that you have a team that can navigate that morass efficiently and effectively and get the outcomes and approvals that it needs to function.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Leticia, you've been a founder, investor, ecosystem builder in the Mexican and LATAM startup ecosystem for a really long time. The case of Hey Banco is slightly different from Timo because they didn't raise investment in the traditional sense. They were born out of a legacy bank. They're spinning out into their own entity this year. As someone who's been an active player and leader in the Mexican startup ecosystem, I'd love for you to comment first on why you think Hey Banco is an interesting play in the fintech space, and why do you think being born out of a legacy player is an advantage or a disadvantage?
First and foremost, thank you. It's so good to be here with you, Kalsum, and to get to meet Tushar and talk about Timo and Vietnam. I think there's so many similarities between our two markets, so it'll be an interesting discussion. And I think being born out of a legacy player has helped Hey Banco. It has made them a rare blend of having startup agility and legacy stability. And it hits a unique sweet spot in the Mexican market because it's digitally native in its design and its user experience, but it's built on top of the regulatory strength and infrastructure of Banregio, which was a legacy bank in kind of the northern part of Mexico. And that's given it a lot of agility without having them to reinvent the wheel when it comes to compliance, to risk management, credit underwriting, trust, or capital. And I think that has proven to be a big advantage in a market like Mexico, where regulatory hurdles are non-trivial and trust in new financial institutions still has to be earned. They've also, I think, stood out in how it blends personalization of their products with financial inclusion. And for example, their dual function debit card or their secured card and their saving tools are letting you set multiple goals. And they're now building a fractional share investment platform. And all of that is speaking to younger populations, to digital first users who want that flexibility and that control. And they're not just digitizing the banking operation, they're reframing what banking looks like for a mobile native generation, but still underbanked or unbanked. And I think that's a powerful combination. I do want to point out, however, that even though I'm optimistic, I think competition is a killer in the market. So as you mentioned, there's thousands of fintechs that are in the space. So even if they leverage those capacities and those advantages in their favor, I think the big question is if their digital product will be the best product and if they can have a simple, easy to use, attractive offering that everyone wants and that works flawlessly. And their financials seem solid and promising. Their customer base is still small but growing very fast, but they do seem to need to simplify their offering and boost their NPS in order to actually be able to reach underbanked mass markets. And they have the right leadership and instinct, so hopefully they can nail the rest.
I love that. Thanks, Leticia, for sharing that. And I think, like Tushar, I was thinking about Timo actually with some of the stuff that Leticia mentioned, being part of a legacy bank. I know also you were talking a little bit about incumbent banks in Vietnam and what these guys were innovating against. I listened to an interview that Jonas did a little while ago, and he actually talked about the fact that legacy banks and incumbents in Vietnam have actually been really good at creating digital offerings. And so even though Timo has had first mover advantage as being Vietnam's first digital bank in 2015, they're actually not just competing against other fintechs, they're also competing against these incumbents. And so I'm curious for you to talk about a little bit about the competitive landscape. Like, how do you think they've been able to innovate and navigate against that? And I'm sure that was part of the reason you guys decided to invest, why you guys probably continue to be bullish on them. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about your perspective on that.
The first observation I would make is that at scale, the delineation between fintech and non-fintech is irrelevant. Everyone competes in a market for customers. And then from that sort of blanket statement to zooming in, I think it is true that in Vietnam in particular, the major banks have been surprisingly good at making efforts to counter digital competitors. It has surprised us. I would say it's a phenomenon that's very Vietnam specific, and we haven't really seen it to the same extent in other markets. So there's something about the tech pedigree in Vietnam that has enabled even larger banks to build decent products. That said, and I want to delineate when talking about incumbent banks from models like Hey Banco, which are spin-outs, for a bank to, within its organization, build a digital upstart, it is hard. It's still a large bureaucratic organization, change is slower, and a big bank attracts a certain kind of talent, and it doesn't attract a different kind of talent. And the edge that companies like Timo or Hey Banco may have, and certainly this is the case in Timo, is that they've been able to innovate on product much, much faster and roll out changes much, much more quickly. And the main other edge that's often not recognized or valued enough is culture, because these organizations are smaller, they're agile, they're experimental, and they're very mission driven. People come to work for Timo because they want to build the best bank in Vietnam, and they are really passionate about building the best experience for customers. And they use that culture flywheel to attract more and more stronger talent that frankly doesn't want to go work in one of the large, big incumbent banks. Ultimately, these markets, though, they're not static. Agree competition is intense. And it is Timo's job to continue to define the edge of innovation and to know and realize and make peace with the fact that others will copy. You have to just be the innovator. Your innovation speed and DNA really matters. And an example of that, even today, I've seen Timo launch products that I've not seen any bank globally launch, like shared money pots where different users can contribute to savings for trips and for other life goals. And they just need to keep consistently doing more and more of that and offering customers what they can't get anywhere else to stay ahead of the pack.
I think those are really good points. And Leticia, it brings up something about Hey Banco and being part of something that was this legacy institution that has been around for decades. And I'm curious, you talked a little bit about the fact that there is a lot of competition in the Mexican fintech space, not just from local players. I think there's a lot of obviously local fintechs and players in the digital banking space, but also international players with players like Nubank and Revolut entering Mexico. I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more about how it's still early days for them in some ways, but how do you think, what is the DNA that they have that kind of steps away from being that legacy bank? They're spinning out from it in some ways. So that in itself is creating an identity that's different. But how do you feel that they can be innovative and different in a way that can outcompete all these different players?
I think many of the points that Tushar touched on are similar. And I think it's not just about attracting the right type of talent, and culturally you need to be different. I think I see a change happening culturally, not just for people looking for jobs to work in fintechs, but also for clients. I think everyone is demanding more from their financial institutions. They want more transparency, more accessibility, more value. In the Mexican case, there's a lot of competition around the interest rates that you get on savings accounts. And fintechs, I think, are listening, and Hey Banco is listening. And for me, I think because they were born out of a legacy bank, they've been able to leverage some of what makes them slow to go faster. At the same time, the test for any fintech in this market is going to be if you can scale and if you can differentiate against other competitors in the market. And you mentioned obviously Nubank and Revolut, but there's many others. For me, what Hey Banco is doing for that is deeply understanding local behaviors and maintaining their advantage by really leaning into personalization. So a lot more data-driven product design, better customer journeys, localized financial education are things that they need to continue to build on so that they can move faster and be the fintech institution of choice and the digital bank of choice. I think they're going to have to move fast on wealth and credit innovation because of the type of customer they've tapped into. And if HeyX becomes a real platform for investing in US equities, that can be a game changer for the type of client they attract and for how fast their numbers can grow. And they can also build and carve out an opportunity within the SME offerings that they've started to offer, especially with Mexico's underbanked small business sector. So I think they need to move a little faster, but they're playing the home turf with the right instincts. And to your point about Nubank, it's very timely that we're having this conversation. They just announced today that they got the license in Mexico, but that's just the first step. Now they have to go through start of operations with the Mexican Banking Commission. They're going to review their application and see that it matches the operation and the numbers. So this is a period that they can't launch any further products, but Hey Banco can take advantage and leverage the window to focus on that offering, focus on that have clear product that is going to make them the choice, and focus on simplicity and excellence. I think Revolut vis-a-vis Hey Banco is not necessarily going for the same segments. So they'll eventually get there. So in the short term, they're not directly competing. Revolut is considered more premium and is looking at international transfers and FX, etc. Different to Nubank, Revolut open simultaneously in so many markets that I think that may make them slower to grow, and it may distract them in some ways from other players that like Nubank that have 3 markets, or Hey Banco that have 1 market. So hopefully Hey Banco vis-a-vis someone like Revolut can leverage the speed, the agility, and the hyper focus to move downstream faster and become the lead in those segments. And if they can capitalize this head start, it won't, I think, pit them against each other so much in the future, but especially in the short term, they're not going to have to go head to head. And then I do want to mention 3 other models that in Mexico are very prevalent. And Tushar, maybe this is also the case in Vietnam. But we have Mercado Libre, this Argentinian e-commerce giant that has Mercado Pago. In Argentina, it's dominating. In Mexico, it's growing very fast, and they're investing a lot of money. They have very good talent. They're competing with individuals and SMEs, so same segments as Hey Banco. They have a massive pipeline as well through their marketplace, but they haven't yet gotten there. So again, Hey Banco needs to move fast to leverage their first mover advantage. We have retail banks and banks like Coppel and Bancoppel that are also retailers and have longstanding clients and offerings. And I think Coppel has millions of customers that they know intimately through their stores, and they spent years building out financial infrastructure that meets the needs of those customers. So again, Hey Banco needs to find those pipelines to scale at the same rate. And finally, and I don't know if there's an equivalent in Vietnam, but BBVA is a legacy bank that is the largest digital bank in Mexico with the best product offering. They have over 30 million users. They have agile teams. And I think the challenge for BBVA is that Mexico has become such a major income generator for them globally that if anything changes, and with these new banks offering better savings account, offering better products, they're going to have pressure to maintain the market, to maintain the model and look at their fees, because no one is happy with high fees.
Tushar, you're based in Singapore. Singapore is largely seen as the fintech leader in Southeast Asia, but Vietnam is very much seen as like that kind of dynamic hub that's very much emerged. And obviously, Leticia, Mexico is one of the major fintech hubs in Latin America. I'm curious for both of you, what do you both think is the most exciting spaces within the fintech space overall in both of your markets? I don't know, maybe Leticia go first, and Tushar, if you want to bring us home.
Perfect. So I think all segments obviously have upside, but I'd argue that for Mexico, the biggest untapped potential is still among the unbanked and the underbanked. And this is not just because of the volume. So around 35 to 40% of adults in Mexico are still outside the formal financial system, but because their needs are specific and historically ignored by banks, right? So fintechs and digital banks and other financial players can really build trust with that segment through products that are designed for them from the ground up. So credit building tools, remittance-based income verification methods, flexible saving accounts. If you can win the unbanked and underbanked segment, they will turn into sticky and loyal customers. And that said, I think there's some overlap with Gen Z. And so with Gen Z is where you build the long-term brand equity and lifetime value, because they'll be customers in the long term and they're already mobile first. They expect intuitive and gamified on demand, everything, not just financial services. And you can experiment and test adoption curves quickly with that segment. And many of them are unbanked and are within that same kind of socioeconomic and demographic group as the ones who have been historically ignored. And so I think that's where the real impact and growth align with kind of the unbanked in Mexico.
That's great. And Tushar, before you share, Jonas said something once on an interview that I thought was great. He talked about the fact that Vietnam doesn't just have an unbanked and underbanked problem. It's also people that are unhappily banked, in terms of people that have banking products but aren't actually happy with their products. So I'd love to hear your thought on that too as you answer the rest of the question.
I think he's right. I think it's just a function of the dynamic I described earlier around incumbent banks in these markets not really being able to keep pace with the demands of the growing middle class segment, the growing wealth segment, and the youth segment, which really creates that opportunity for digital experiences and digital banks to enter. Other than that, though, I'd say it's fascinating how what Leticia is saying is to markets like Vietnam, the percentages might change. The percentage under bank might be 60% versus 45%, but the trends are very much the same. And for me, I think what's exciting, if you ask me like which segments are exciting, the reality is they're all exciting. Like unbanked is exciting, underbanked is exciting, unhappily banked is exciting. They're all very large. But you can't go after all of them at the same time. So as a company, you have to really pick which segment you're going after and really build for that segment. And related to what Leticia was saying, I think the thing that I've seen time and time again is if you can get it right in your first incarnation, your first wave, you earn trust, and trust, particularly in financial services, is paramount. And if you can build trust, you have the potential to become a platform and you can distribute many other products and services. So Timo today is a payment-centric bank. But if Timo can get trust through payments, then it can also distribute credit. It's already distributing credit and starting to distribute insurance. And that's just the start. And I think in time, it can move to wealth as well. And the other sort of zoom out lens that I would give your listeners is you sometimes don't realize, because you live in more developed markets or markets which are further along the curve, where some of these emerging markets are on their journey. For example, many people don't know this. In Vietnam, there's no real-time settlement on the stock exchange. So if you buy a stock today, it'll take you 2 days to settle it. That's not the case in many of the developed markets. And if you look at what's driven Robinhood and Coinbase and all of their volume, is real-time settlement. And that, of course, is coming. And I think when that comes, it's going to just spark this whole new wave of innovation and growth and users coming in to invest. And if you're a brand at that time that's trusted and you can offer the right product at the right time, you can ride that wave for the next couple of decades and build a business off it. So it's those kinds of emerging market trends or arbitrages that are really fascinating to me.
Great. Thank you guys so much. I was nodding a lot because this is also quite analogous to Pakistan, I'm sure to a lot of other emerging markets with similar demographics. And so that's the whole thesis of this podcast. And I really thank you both for making the time to join us for this segment. So thank you guys so much. That's it for our episode 2. Thanks for tuning in. And please stay tuned for future episodes where each one we dive into a different sector and look at 2 companies building side by side in 2 different emerging markets. For our next episode, we'll be looking at education technology, which is an interesting sector to look at as a VC. And we'll be talking to 2 companies building in Jordan and Bangladesh. Stay tuned and see you next time. Bye.